Senator Davis, for what purpose you rise?
To ask the author some questions, if
Senator
you'll
Hager,
yield.
yield.
Yes, I do.
Thank you, Senator Hager. I want to ask you some questions about subchapter D of the bill, which is the subchapter that deals with the administration of RU 486.
Yes, please. Did you say what page? I'm sorry.
Subchapter D begins.
Okay, I didn't know if you were going to just reference a page, but
No,
if not, just a
I
general
wasn't going to
question.
speak
That's
to any
okay.
language in particular, but in general, I just
Okay.
want to make sure
Okay,
I
I'm sorry.
understand.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
particularly. And I'm going to start by talking about the sonogram bill that was passed last session, which, as we know, as a consequence of that bill, a woman now must make, unless she fits within the exception
the
that Senator Uresti
100
was
mile
able
limit. Yes, ma'am.
to get, she must make 2 visits in order to receive abortion services in the state of Texas. The first of which is a visit where she has a sonogram.
Yes.
The doctor at that visit describes the fetal development for her. She may or may not view the sonogram. It's her choice. She is to listen to the heartbeat. And then on the following day, it has to actually, 24-hour period of time
Yes.
has to pass. Then she comes back for that second visit, correct?
Yes. Well, unless she lives in the exception period outside.
Correct.
Yes, ma'am.
Correct.
Or if there's a judicial bypass or the other types of situations.
And in that situation, the same physician has to see her on both that first visit for the sonogram and for the second visit, correct?
I believe that's correct.
And in this bill now, with the RU 486 requirement, the woman would have to come for the sonogram.
Correct.
She would come back on the second day to be administered the first dosage of the medication under that regime, correct?
According to FDA guidelines, yes.
And the same doctor has to be there to provide both of those services to her.
The physician does, yes, according to the guidelines, yes.
And then on the third day, she has to come back for the second administration of that medication.
Yes, as according to the FDA guidelines, and then the dosage is also according to the Association of Gynecology, the research that they had done, yes.
And then 2 weeks goes by, 14 days later, she has to come back, and again, that same physician has to see her for her follow-up exam.
There is an effort to make a follow-up visit after 14 days, yes.
Well, it's required, actually, in the statute.
Well, the statute requires that the physician and the office attempt to have her to come in for a follow-up visit, and if she does not, to note that in the records. But yes, there's a requirement to try to come back for a final visit to assess the health and whether there's any excess bleeding, specifically is what the language is stating.
There's actually a requirement that she be instructed to return in that
Correct. That is
14-day
correct.
period.
That is
And
correct.
I
That is
agree with
correct.
you. I mean, there's nothing that can actually force that, but of
Right.
course, she's instructed as part of the regime that she
Correct.
should
Correct.
do that. So now we're talking about 4 visits that a woman must make, whereas before the sonogram bill passed a session ago, there was 1 visit that a woman made to the clinic for this purpose.
For the first 3, yes, and the last one is an effort for her to come back. But again, like you said,
Right.
it's not a guaranteed whether she would return.
Understand. But we know that she's going to have to come at least 3 times.
That is correct.
Okay.
And as long as she lives within that 100-mile radius, yes.
And we've been hearing information about the fact that women who have had to return for that second visit, even under the sonogram laws that exist today, have met some hardship in having to do that, particularly if they have to travel a distance that's less than the 100-mile exception, but some distance in order to return. There was testimony to that. I've heard that testimony.
I have heard different arguments, and again, whether it's testimony or here on the floor about distances as requirements. Senator Uresti has talked a lot about his district being the former largest district, now a little bit smaller, only facility in San Antonio. He doesn't have any clinics in the other parts of his district, so people have to drive a distance to go to San Antonio or El Paso.
Okay. And this right now, under the way the bill is written, would have to occur in an ambulatory surgical center, each of those 4 visits that the woman would have.
This is unless that there is a physician that performs 50 or less abortions in a year, which this bill does not apply, and neither has prior legislation applied to.
And in the instance, though, where it does apply, it would have to take place in an ambulatory surgical center.
If they are going to an abortion clinic, and the abortion clinic is now an ASC standard, yes, if they are going to a clinic, it would be to an ambulatory surgical center under this bill. But there are other options out there.
Okay, and in the bill, there has certainly been testimony that's been provided at the hearings both on the Senate side and on the House side, and I know there's some disagreements about the extent to which closures of the existing abortion clinics would occur as a consequence of ambulatory surgical center requirements.
Yes,
but
ma'am.
there's certainly been testimony provided that the expense and the time to either convert existing facilities to ambulatory surgical centers would be fairly significant. So let's just say, at least for a time period, those that don't meet that standard would close. Maybe some will reopen, and time, of course, will tell.
I do not believe that by the September 1 of 2014, I have never believed that every clinic I've heard arguments that every one of the 37 or so many would close, and I've never believed that they all would close, because there was a time period to allow them to come up to those standards, and I still believe that there will be clinics that rise to that standard. And as you know, Planned Parenthood and other facilities, some of the new clinics that they've opened, they have opened up as ASCs.
Their most recent one in Fort Worth, yes.
Correct.
Yes, they
Yes,
did.
ma'am.
In anticipation of this, because they were seeing this law spread, of course, all over the country. But are you aware that in 2004, when the law was passed that requires that terminations of pregnancies that are post 16 weeks must occur in ambulatory surgical centers, after the passage of that law in 2004, it was a 2.5-year period of time before the first ambulatory surgical center was up and functioning and able to offer that service in Texas. And for that entire 2.5-year period of time, there wasn't a single reported legal abortion in Texas that occurred post 16 weeks. Women who sought that care left the state of Texas in order to receive it.
And remind me, how many years ago was that?
That was in 2004.
Okay, and 4, and I don't recall offhand, you might, did we have the number of ASCs that are available in the state of Texas back at that date? So
Well, actually, there were a large number of ASCs available.
Probably not the 460 so
Right,
that we have
but there were several hundred, and none of them was willing to accept and provide this service as part of the services that they were providing.
But we have 4 times that number today.
I understand.
So my point is just simply that a lot has changed in those 10 years to be able to provide different types of quality of access to people here in the state of Texas.
A lot of assuming going on, but
No,
let's
I
just
know
say,
that the facts are that it's 4 times the number of ASCs that were at that point in
let's
time.
just say that,
That's not an
the
assumption.
pattern that happened after the passage of the 2004 law continues to be the pattern that we see today. And I think for good reason that is likely to be the case. Obviously, abortion facilities are facilities that aren't without controversy. Typically, people exercise, as they are perfectly entitled to do, their First Amendment rights outside of those facilities. Ambulatory surgical centers that existed at the time chose not to allow those services to be provided there because they simply didn't want to deal with the consequences of allowing those procedures to occur within them. And I think it's likely that pattern will replicate itself today. And it's also likely that the pattern of the time period it took for ambulatory surgical centers to be built or existing facilities to be converted, that first one took 2.5 years, and now there are only 5, and it took 8 years to get to 5. It took a very long time to get to 5. So let's just say in the worst case scenario, that those are all that are left for a while.
But I don't think that's going to be the case, Senator.
I know that's what you think.
Okay, thank you. Go
Others
ahead.
think differently.
Okay, I
So
respect that.
let's just play the game of
Well, I don't
worst
want-
case scenario.
Well,
Worst case scenario,
you go
let's
ahead
say
and play
that's what
that.
happens. And now we have women, if they want to access a medical abortion by taking RU 486, which a large number of abortions today occur through that procedure. Now, a woman who lives in El Paso, for example, will have to travel all the way to San Antonio or Houston, and that woman will have to return to that clinic 4 times. We know at least 3 times she's going to have to. On the 4th time, with the doctor's order, and most people tend to follow doctor's orders. Are you concerned at all about the expense and the time that women will have to take in order to access a service that today is much less cumbersome for them?
Well, I also believe that increasing the standards is important, Senator, that this bill is accomplishing to provide a higher quality, and I know we disagree on that, and I absolutely respect you for that disagreement, that I believe this bill is raising the standards. Do I share a concern of access and quality of care? I mentioned during Senator Nelson's committee that I've learned so much about the limiting ability, and I referenced this earlier, far as to adoptions in the state of Texas, and I'm concerned about that. That's something that I want to work on now, and I've never been experienced to that before, but I am not going to go down the path that do I believe that there will only be 4 or 5 clinics if this bill passes because of some facts that you provide for 10 years ago, when I also know that ASC clinics are being built today. We have 4 times the number we did 10 years ago.
We have 4 times the number of ASCs.
That's correct, of ASCs, I'm sorry, that's what I meant. And then also, when I just used for the easiest one is Pennsylvania, for when they came up to the ASC standard, every clinic was going to close. It was going to go to the worst case scenario, and that did not happen.
Senator Hare, I'm not familiar with how long it took in Pennsylvania. I know Pennsylvania is a much, much smaller state.
It is, that's correct.
And I'm simply asking you the question, if it's the case that it takes longer than the time period allowed in this bill, which is in 2014, for these ambulatory surgical centers to be created, built either from the ground up or because there are renovations of existing facilities, does it concern you that women who need to access this legal, constitutionally protected right that they possess, that they will be put in a situation where they will not have the ability to access it because it will not be available to them, both because it will be at great cost in terms of travel, or because they simply cannot afford the time off from work or childcare or the time away from their families that it may require?
I believe that a large number of these clinics are going to come up to standards, and they are going to come up to standards.
On what do you
and
base
the
that?
quality of access that you were worried about, that you were saying will be denied, I do not believe it will be denied, Senator.
On what do you base your belief?
I base the belief on looking back at what has happened in other states and the fact that many of those clinics came up to standards in 6 months, less than a year.
So let's go back to the actual provision of the medication at the
Yes.
ambulatory surgical center. Why is it important that a woman take the doses of this medicine in the presence of a physician at an ambulatory surgical center? In what way does that increase a standard of care or provide a safer environment for women who use this form?
Whether it is in I think first, if you allow me, in the presence of a physician, whether that's in a physician at an ambulatory surgical center or in the presence of a physician who provide 50 or less abortions a year. In either of those two situations, it's in the presence of a physician. And I believe that in the presence of a physician, for the complications that can arise from a medical abortion, the RU-486 drug, the higher incidence rate of complications, 20% higher rate, 700% higher rate for severe complications of hemorrhaging, I believe that a physician needs to be present to be able to monitor, and the follow-up visit, the fourth, which we cannot guarantee whether they will actually appear, but to actually be able to assess, the physician is the one that is most qualified to be able to determine if there's significant consequences or any type of complications.
Senator Hager,
Yes, ma'am.
the bill requires that the woman be administered the dose by her physician. It does not require that she stay in the physician's presence during the time period it takes for the abortion of the fetus to actually occur. In fact, under the terms of the bill today, the woman takes the first dose in the presence of her physician
And leaves.
and leaves.
Yes.
She takes the second dose in the presence of her physician
And leaves.
and leaves. So I'm asking you again, how does that requirement create a safer standard of care for women when the physical consequence of taking that drug is not going to occur while she's at the doctor's office?
Because her and the doctor have a stronger relationship. The doctor has the ability to assess whether it meets the guidelines, the criteria, to assess to whether she is a candidate, and to be able to have any complications, whether that's in the presence or afar. That doctor can assess whether that person, that individual, is the best candidate for that drug.